The secret ingredient. In their attempt to justify the existence of a ruling class, government, statists often describe perfectly reasonable, legitimate, useful things and then proclaim them to be government. They may argue, once people cooperate to form an organized system of mutual defense, that's government. Or they may claim, when people collectively decide the way things like roads and commerce and property rights will work in their town, that's government. Or they may say, when people pool their resources to do things collectively rather than each individual having to do everything for himself, that is government. None of those statements are true. Such assertions are intended to make government sound like a natural, legitimate, and useful part of human society. But all of them completely miss the fundamental nature of government. Government is not organization, cooperation, or mutual agreement. Countless groups and organizations, supermarkets, football teams, car companies, archery clubs, etc., engage in cooperative, mutually beneficial collective actions, but they are not called government because they are not imagined to have the right to rule. And that is the secret ingredient that makes something authority, the supposed right to forcibly control others. Governments do not just evolve out of supermarkets or football teams, nor do they evolve out of people preparing and providing for their mutual defense. There is a fundamental difference between how can we effectively defend ourselves and I have the right to rule you. Contrary to what civics textbooks may claim, governments are not the result of either economics or basic human interaction. They do not just happen as a result of people being civilized and organized. They are entirely the product of the myth that someone has to be in charge. Without the superstition of authority, no amount of cooperation or organization would ever become government. It requires a drastic change in public perception for a service provider, whether the service is food, shelter, information, protection, or anything else, to transform into a rightful ruler. A system of organization cannot magically become government any more than a security guard can magically become a king. And the fact relates to another claim of statists, that doing away with government would simply result in violent gangs gaining power, which would in turn become a new government. But violent conquest does not naturally become government any more than peaceful cooperation does. Unless the new gang is imagined to have the right to rule, it will not be seen as government. In fact, the ability to control modern populations, especially armed populations, depends entirely upon the perceived legitimacy of the would-be controllers. Today, to rule any population of significant size by brute force alone would require an enormous amount of resources, weapons, spies, mercenaries, etc. So much so that it would be nearly impossible. The specter of a gang of ruthless thugs taking over a country may make for an entertaining movie, but it cannot actually happen in a country equipped with even basic communications and firearms. The only way to control a large population today is for the would-be ruler to first convince the people that he has the moral right to exert control over them. He can acquire domination only if he can first hammer the myth of authority into his intended victims' heads, thereby convincing the victims that he is legitimate and proper government. And if he can accomplish that, very little actual force will be required for him to acquire and maintain power. But if his regime ever loses legitimacy in the eyes of his victims, or if he never achieves it to begin with, brute force alone will not provide him with any lasting power. In short, neither gangs nor cooperatives can ever become government, unless the people believe that someone has the right to rule them. Likewise, once the people as a whole free themselves from the myth of authority, they will not need any revolution to be free. Government will simply cease to exist because the only place it has ever existed is in the minds of those who believe in the superstition of authority. Again, the politicians and the mercenaries who carry out their threats are very real, but without perceived legitimacy, they are recognized as a gang of power-happy thugs, not a government. It should also be mentioned that some have claimed, including Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, that it is possible and desirable to have a government which does nothing except protect the rights of individuals. But an organization which did only that would not be government. Every individual has the right to defend himself and others against attackers. To exercise that right, even though a very organized large-scale operation would not be government any more than organized large-scale food production constitutes government. I'm going to read that over, I'm sorry. Every individual has the right to defend himself and others against attackers. To exercise that right, even through a very organized large-scale operation, would not be government, any more than organized large-scale food production constitutes government. For something to be government, it must by definition do something that average people do not have the right to do. A government with the same right as everyone else is not a government, any more than the average man on the street is government. The excuse of necessity. The excuse that statists, people who believe in government, often resort to, in the end, is that humanity requires government, that society needs rulers, that someone has to be in charge, or there would be constant chaos and bloody mayhem. But necessity, whether real or imagined, cannot make a mythical entity real. A right to rule is not going to come into existence just because we supposedly need it in order to have a peaceful society. No one would argue that Santa Claus must be real because we need him in order for Christmas to work. If authority does not and cannot exist, as will be proven below, saying that we need it is not only pointless but obviously untrue. We cannot conjure something into existence by sheer willpower. If you jump out of a plane without a parachute, your need for a parachute is not going to make one materialize. By the same token, if it is impossible for one person to acquire the right to rule over another, and impossible for one person to acquire the obligation to subjugate himself to another, as proven below, then claiming that such things need to happen is an empty argument. Part 2. The disproofs of authority. Letting go of the myth. A growing number of people now believe that government is not necessary and that human society would, on a practical level, work a lot better without it. Others argue that regardless of which works better, society without a coercive state is the only moral choice, as it is the only choice that does not support the initiation of violence against innocent people. While such arguments are both valid and worthwhile, there is actually a more fundamental point that renders such discussions moot. Authority, whether moral or not, and whether it works or not, cannot exist. This is not merely a statement of what should be, it is a description of what is. If authority cannot exist, as will be logically proven below, any debate about whether we need it or how well it works on a practical level is pointless. Accordingly, the point of this book is not that government should be abolished, but that government, a legitimate ruling class, does not and cannot exist, and that failure to recognize this fact has led to immeasurable suffering and injustice. Even most of those who recognize government as a huge threat to humanity speak of doing away with it as if it actually exists. They speak as if there is a choice between having a government and not having a government. There is not. Government is a logical impossibility. The problem is not actually government, but the belief in government. By analogy, one who realizes that Santa Claus is not real does not start to crusade to abolish Santa, or to evict him from the North Pole. He simply stops believing in him. The difference is that the belief in Santa Claus does little harm, while the belief in the mythical beast called authority has led to unimaginable pain and suffering, oppression and injustice. The message here is not that we should try to create a world without authority. It is that it would behoove human beings to accept the fact that a world without authority is all that has ever existed, and that mankind would be far better off and people would behave in a far more rational, moral, and civilized manner if that fact were widely understood. Why the myth is tempting. Before demonstrating that authority cannot exist, brief mention should be made of why anyone would want such a thing to exist. It is obvious why those who seek dominion over others want government to exist. It gives them an easy, allegedly legitimate mechanism through which they can forcibly control others. But why would anyone else, why would those being controlled want it to exist? The mindset of statists usually starts with a reasonable concern, but ends with an insane solution. The average person who looks out at the world knowing there are billions of human beings out there, many of whom are stupid or hostile, naturally wants some sort of assurance that he will be protected from all the negligent and malicious things others may do. Most believers in government openly describe that as the reason government is needed, because people cannot be trusted, because it is man's nature to steal, fight, etc. Statists often assert that without a controlling authority, without government making the end enforcing the rules of society on everyone, every dispute would end in bloodshed. There would be little or no cooperation. Trade would all but cease. It would be every man for himself, and humanity would degrade into a caveman or Mad Max type of existence. As a result, the debate between statism and anarchism is often incorrectly assumed to be a question of whether people are inherently good and trustworthy, and therefore need no controllers, or are inherently bad and untrustworthy, and therefore need government to control them. In truth, whether human beings are all good, all bad, or something in between, the belief in authority is still an irrational superstition. But the most popular excuse for government, that people are bad and need to be controlled, inadvertently exposes the lunacy inherent in all statism. To wit, if human beings are so careless and stupid and malicious that they cannot be trusted to do the right thing on their own, how would the situation be improved by taking a subset of those very same careless, stupid, and malicious human beings and giving them societal permission to forcibly control all the others? I am going to read that again. That is so good. To wit, if human beings are so careless, stupid, and malicious that they cannot be trusted to do the right thing on their own, how would the situation be improved by taking a subset of those very same careless, stupid, and malicious human beings and giving them societal permission to forcibly control all others? Why would anyone think that rearranging and reorganizing a group of dangerous beasts would make them civilized? The answer hints at the mythological nature of the belief in authority. It is not merely a different arrangement of human beings that authoritarians seek, but the involvement of some superhuman entity with rights that human beings do not have and with virtues that human beings do not have, which can be used to keep all the untrustworthy humans in line. To say that human beings are so flawed that they need to be controlled, a common refrain among statists, implies that something other than human beings needs to do the controlling. But no matter how hard you study government, you will find that it is always run entirely by people. Saying that government is necessary because people are untrustworthy is as irrational as saying that if someone is being attacked by a swarm of bees, the solution is to create an authoritarian hierarchy among the bees, assigning some of the bees the duty of preventing the other bees from doing the harm. However dangerous the bees may be, such a solution is ridiculous. What the believers really want out of government is a huge, unstoppable power that will be used for good. But there is no magic trick, political or otherwise, capable of guaranteeing that justice will occur, that the good guys will win, or that the innocent will be protected and cared for. The giant, superhuman, magical savior that statists insist is needed to save humanity from itself does not exist. On this planet, at least, human beings are the top. There is nothing above them to control them and make them behave properly, and hallucinating such a superhuman entity does not make it real, nor does it help the situation. The religion of government. Government is neither a scientific concept nor a rational sociological construct, nor is it a logical, practical method of human organization and cooperation. The belief in government is not based on reason. It is based on faith. In truth, the belief in government is a religion made up of a set of dogmatic teachings, irrational doctrines which fly in the face of both evidence and logic, and which are methodically memorized and repeated by the faithful. Like other religions, the gospel of government describes a superhuman, supernatural entity above mere mortals which issues commandments to the peasantry, for whom unquestioning obedience is a moral imperative. Disobeying to the commandments, breaking the law, is viewed as a sin, and the faithful delight in the punishment of the infidels and sinners, criminals, while at the same time taking great pride in their own loyalty and humble subservience to their God, as law-abiding taxpayers. And while the mortals may humbly beg their Lord for favors and for permission to do certain things, it is considered blasphemous and outrageous for one of the lowly peasants to imagine himself to be fit to decide which of the government god's laws he should follow and which is okay for him to ignore. Their mantra is, you can work to try to change the law, but as long as it's the law, we all have to follow it. The religious nature of the belief in authority is put on display for all to see whenever people solemnly stand with their hands upon their hearts and religiously proclaim their undying faith in and loyalty to a flag and a government, the Republic. It rarely occurs to those who recite the Pledge of Allegiance, while feeling deep pride, that what they're actually doing is swearing allegiance to a system of subjugation and authoritarian control. In short, they are promising to do as they are told and behave as loyal subjects to their masters. Aside from the patently inaccurate phrase at the end about liberty and justice for all, the entire pledge is about subservience to the government, which claims to represent the collective, as if that in itself is some great and noble goal. The pledge and the mentality and emotions it is intended to stir up would apply equally well to any tyrannical regime in history. It is a promise to be obedient and easily controlled, to subordinate oneself to the Republic, rather than a promise to do the right thing. Many other patriotic rituals and songs, as well as the overtly religious reverence given to two pieces of parchment, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, also demonstrate that people do not merely view government as a practical necessity. They view it as a god, to be praised and worshipped, honored, and obeyed. The main factor distinguishing the belief in government from other religions today is the people actually believe in the God called government. The other gods people claim to believe in and the churches they attend are now, by comparison, little more than empty rituals and half-heartedly parroted superstitions. When it comes to their everyday lives, the God that people actually pray to save them from misfortune, to smite their enemies and to shower them with blessings, is government. It is government whose commandments the people most often respect and obey. Whenever a conflict arises between government and the teachings of the lesser gods, such as pay your fair share, taxation versus thou shalt not steal, or duty to country, military service versus thou shalt not murder, the commands of government supersede all the teachings of the other religions. Politicians, the high priests of the church of government, the mouthpieces and representatives of government, who deliver the sacred law from on high, even openly declare that it is impermissible for people to practice whatever religion they wish, as long as they do not run afoul of the supreme religion of disobeying the law, meaning the dictates of the God called government. Perhaps most telling is that if you suggest to an average person that maybe God does not exist, he will likely respond with less emotion and hostility than if you bring up the idea of life without government. This indicates which religion people are more deeply emotionally attached to, and which religion they actually believe in more firmly. In fact, they believe so deeply in government that they do not even recognize it as being a belief at all. The reason so many people respond to the idea of a stateless society, anarchy, with insults, apocalyptic prediction, and emotional tantrums, rather than with calm reasoning, is because their belief in government is not the result of careful, rational consideration of evidence and logic. It is in every way a religious faith, believed only because of prolonged indoctrination. And there is almost nothing which state worshippers find more existentially terrifying than contemplating the possibility that government, their savior and protector, teacher and master, does not actually exist and never did. Excuse me. Many political rituals have overtly religious overtones to them. The grandiose cathedral-like buildings, the pomp and circumstance at inauguration and other government ceremonies, the traditional costumes and age-old rituals, the way the members of the ruling class are treated and described, e.g. honorable, all give such proceedings an air of holiness and reverence, far more indicative of religious rites than a practical means of collective organization. It might be nice to have some morally superior, all-powerful deity to protect the innocent and to prevent injustice. And that is what statists hope government will be, a wise, unbiased, all-knowing, and all-powerful final decider that will override and supersede the flawed, short-sighted, and selfish whims of man, unerringly dispensing justice and fairness. However, there is no such thing, and can be no such thing, and there are many reasons why it is utterly foolish to look to government as the solution to human imperfection. For example, what almost every statist wants is for government to enforce objective rules of civilized behavior. More specifically, each individual wants his own perception of justice and morality to be enforced by authority, while failing to realize that the moment there is an authority, it is no longer up to that individual to decide what counts as moral or just. The authority will claim the right to do that for him. And so over and over again, believers in authority have tried to create an all-powerful force for good by anointing some people as rulers, only to quickly learn that once the master is on the throne, he does not care what his slaves were hoping he would do with the power they gave him. And this has happened to all kinds of statists with very different beliefs and agendas. Socialists assert that government is needed to fairly redistribute wealth. Objectivists assert that government is needed to protect individual rights. Constitutionalists assert that a government is needed to carry out only those tasks listed in the Constitution. Believers in democracy assert that government is needed to carry out the will of the majority. And many Christians assert that government is needed to enforce God's laws. And so on. And in every case, the people end up disappointed because the authority always changes the plan in order to serve the interests of the people in power. Once a set of rulers are in charge, what the masses had intended for them to do with their power does not matter. This fact has been demonstrated by every government in history. Once the people create a master, the people, by definition, are no longer in charge. To expect otherwise, even without all of the historical examples, is absurd. To expect the master to serve the slave, to expect power to be used solely for the beliefs of the one being controlled, not the one in control, is ridiculous. That makes it even more insane. What makes it even more insane is that statists claim that appointing rulers is the only way to overcome the imperfections and untrustworthiness of men. Statists look out at a world full of strangers who have questionable motives and dubious morality, and they are afraid of what some of those people might do. That, in and of itself, is a perfectly reasonable concern. But then, as protection against what some of those people might do, the statists advocate giving some of those people, those same people, of questionable virtue, a huge amount of power and societal permission to rule over everyone else. in the vain hope that by some miracle those people will happen to decide to use their newfound power only for good. In other words, the statist looks at his fellow man and thinks, I do not trust you as my neighbor, but I do trust you as my master. Bizarrely, almost every statist admits that politicians are more dishonest, corrupt, conniving, and selfish than most people, but still insists that civilization can exist only if those particularly untrustworthy people are given both the power and the right to forcibly control everyone else. Believers in government truly believe that the only thing that can keep them safe from the flaws of human nature is taking some of those flawed humans, some of the most flawed, in fact, and appointing them as gods, with the right to dominate all of mankind in the absurd hope that if given such a tremendous power, such people will use it only for good. And the fact that has never happened in the history of the world does not stop statists from insisting that it needs to happen to ensure peaceful civilization. Okay, author's personal note. I say all of this as a former devout statist who for most of my life not only accepted the self-contradictions and delusional rationalizations underlying the myth of government, but vehemently spread the mythology myself. I did not escape my own authoritarian indoctrination quickly or comfortably, but let go of the superstition slowly and reluctantly, with much intellectual kicking and screaming along the way. I mentioned that only so that it may be understood that when I refer to the belief in authority as utterly irrational and insane, I am attacking my own prior beliefs as much as anyone else's. Another way to look at this is that the statists worry that different people have different beliefs, different viewpoints, different standards of morality. They express concerns such as, what if there is no government and someone thinks it's okay to kill me and steal my stuff? Yes, if there are conflicting views, as there always have been and always will be, they can lead to conflict. The authoritarian solution is that instead of everyone deciding for himself what is right and what he should do, there should be a central authority that will make one set of rules that will be enforced on everyone. Statists obviously hope that the authority will issue and enforce the right rules, but they never explain how or why this would happen. Since the edicts of government are written by mere human beings, usually exceptionally power-hungry, corrupt human beings, why should anyone expect their rules to be better than the rules each individual would choose for himself? The belief in government does not make everyone agree. It only creates an opportunity to drastically escalate personal disagreements into large-scale wars and mass oppression. Nor does having an authority settling a dispute do anything to guarantee that the right side wins. Yet statists talk as if government will be fair, reasonable, and rational in situations where individuals would not be. Again, this demonstrates that beliefs in government imagine authority to have superhuman virtues that should be trusted above the virtues of mere mortals. History shows otherwise. A twisted sense of morality in one person or a few can result in the murder of one person or even dozens. But that same twisted sense of morality in just a few people, when they get hold of the machine called government, can result in the murder of millions. The statist wants his idea of the good rules forced on everyone by a central authority, but has no way to make that happen and no reason to expect that it will happen. In their search for an all-powerful good guy to save the day, statists always end up creating all-powerful bad guys. Over and over again they build giant, unstoppable government monsters in the hope that they will defend the innocent, only to find that the monsters became a far greater threat to the innocent than the threats they were created to protect against. Ironically, what statists actually advocate in their attempts to guarantee justice for all is the legitimization of evil. The truth is that all the belief in authority ever does, and all it can ever do, is to introduce more immoral violence into society. This is not an unfortunate coincidence or the side effect of basically good idea. It is a truism based upon nature of the belief in authority, and this is easy to logically prove. Authority equals immoral violence. Almost everyone agrees that sometimes physical force is justified and sometimes it is not. Though there is a large debatable gray area, it is generally accepted that aggressive force, the initiation of violence against another person, is unjustified and immoral. This would include theft, assault, and murder, as well as more indirect forms of aggression such as vandalism and fraud. On the other hand, using force in defense of the innocent is widely accepted as justified and moral, even noble. The legitimacy of such force is determined by the situation it is used in, not by who is using it. To simplify, the types of force which anyone has the right to use can be termed good force, and any acts of force which normal people do not have the right to commit can be termed bad force. The reader can apply his own standards, and the logic here will still apply. However, agents of authority are imagined to have the right to use force not only in the situations where anyone would have such a right, but in other situations as well. It stands to reason that if everyone has the right to use inherently justified good force, and the law authorizes agents of the government to use force in other situations as well, then law is an attempt to legitimize bad force. In short, authority is permission to commit evil, to do things that would be recognized as immoral and unjustified if anyone else did them. Obviously, neither the enthusiastic voter who proudly posts a campaign sign in his yard, nor the well-intentioned citizen who runs for office understands this fact. If they did, they would understand that democracy is nothing more than majority-approved immoral violence and cannot possibly fix society or be a tool for freedom or justice. Despite the mythology which claims that a person's vote is his voice and that the right to vote is what makes people free, the truth is that all democracy does is legitimize aggression and unjustified violence. The logic of this is so simple and obvious that an enormous amount of propaganda is needed in order to train people to not see it. If everyone has the right to use inherently righteous force, and government agents are allowed to use force in other situations as well, then by its very nature, what government adds to society is immoral violence. The problem is that the people are taught that when violence has been made legal and is committed by authority, it changes from immoral violence to righteous law enforcement. The fundamental premise upon which all government rests is the idea that what would be morally wrong for the average person to do can be morally right when done by agents of authority, implying that the standards of moral behavior which apply to human beings do not apply to agents of government, again hinting that the thing called government is superhuman. Inherently righteous force, which most people generally agree is limited to defensive force, does not require any law or special authority to make it valid. The only thing that law and government are needed for, and the only thing it adds to society more inherently unjust violence. No one who understands this simple truth would ever claim that government is essential to human civilization. The notion that man-made law can negate the usual rules of civilized behavior has some fairly terrifying ramifications. If government is not limited by basic human morality, which the very concept of authority implies, by what standards or principles would government action be limited at all? If 30% taxation is valid, why wouldn't 100% taxation not be valid? If legal theft is legitimate and just, why couldn't legalized torture and murder be legitimate and just? If some collective seed requires society to have an institution that has an exemption from morality, why would there be any limits on what it can do? If exterminating an entire race, or outlawing a religion, or forcibly enslaving millions is deemed necessary for the common good, by what moral standards could anyone complain once they have accepted the premise of authority? All belief in government rests on the idea that common good justifies the legal initiation of violence against innocents to one degree or another. And once that premise has been accepted, there is no objective moral standard to limit government behavior. History shows this all too clearly. Almost everyone accepts the myth that human beings are not trustworthy enough, not moral enough, not wise enough to accept, hello, Mr. Mailman, not wise enough to exist in peace without a government to keep them in line. Even many who agree that there would be no rulers in an ideal society often opine that human beings are not ready for such a society. Such sentiments based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what authority is and what it adds to society. Okay. Such sentiments are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what authority is and what it adds to society. Excuse me. The idea of government as a necessary evil, as Patrick Henry described it, implies that the existence of government imposes restraints upon the violent, aggressive nature of human beings, when in reality it does not. It does the exact opposite. The belief in authority legitimizes and legalizes aggression. Regardless of how foolish or wise human beings are, or how malicious or virtuous they might be, to say that human beings are not ready for a stateless society or cannot be trusted to exist without having an authority that they bow to is to say that peaceful civilization can exist only if there is a huge, powerful machine that introduces an enormous amount of immoral violence into society. Of course, statists do not recognize that violence as immoral, because to them it is not mere mortals committing the violence, but representatives of the deity known as government. And deities have the right to do things that mortals do not. When described in accurate literal terms, this nearly universally held belief that it is necessary to introduce immoral violence into society in order to prevent people from committing immoral violence is exposed as the patently absurd myth that it is. But everyone who believes in the myth of government has to believe exactly that. They do not believe it is a result of rational thought and logic. They accept it as an article of faith because it is part of the unquestionable doctrine of the Church of Government. Who gave them the right? There are several ways to demonstrate that the mythology the public is taught about government is self-contradictory and irrational, and an irrational one. That the simplest ways is to ask the question, how does someone acquire the right to rule another? The old superstitions asserted that certain people were specifically ordained by a god or a group of gods to rule over others. Various legends tell of supernatural events, the Lady of the Lake, the Sword in the Stone, etc., that determined who would have the right to rule over others. Thankfully, humanity has, for the most part, outgrown those silly superstitions. Unfortunately, they have been replaced by new superstitions that are even less rational. At least the old myths attributed to some mysterious higher power the task of appointing certain individuals as rulers over others, something a deity could at least theoretically do. The new justifications for authority, however, claim to accomplish the same amazing feat, but without supernatural assistance. In short, despite all of the complex rituals and convoluted rationalizations, all modern belief in government rests on the notion that mere mortals can, through certain political procedures, bestow upon some people various rights which none of the people possess to begin with. The inherent lunacy of such a notion should be obvious. There is no ritual or document through which any group of people can delegate to someone else the right which no one in the group possesses. And that self-evident truth, all by itself, demolishes any possibility of legitimate government. The average person believes that government has the right to do numerous things that the average individual does not have the right to do on his own. The obvious question then is, how and from whom did those in government acquire such rights? How, for example, whether you call it theft or taxation, would those in government acquire the right to forcibly take property from those who have earned it? No voter has such a right. So how could voters possibly have given such a right to politicians? All modern statism is based entirely on the assumption that people can delegate rights they don't have. Even the U.S. Constitution pretended to grant to Congress the right to tax and regulate certain things, though the authors of the Constitution had no such right themselves and therefore could not possibly have given such a right to anyone else. Okay, because each person has the right to rule himself, as schizophrenic as that idea may be, he can, at least in theory, authorize someone else to rule himself. But a right he does not possess, and therefore cannot delegate to anyone else, is the right to rule someone else. And if government ruled only those individuals who had each willingly delegated the right to rule themselves, it would not be government. And the number of people involved does not affect the logic. To claim that a majority can bestow upon someone a right which none of the individuals in that majority possess is just as irrational as claiming that 3 people, none of whom has a car or money to buy a car, can give a car to someone else. To put it in the simplest terms, you can't give someone something you don't have. And that simple truth all by itself rules out all government, because if those in government have only those rights possessed by those who elected them, then government loses the one ingredient that makes it government, the right to rule over others, authority. If it has the same rights and powers as everyone else, there is no reason to call it government. If the politicians have no more rights than you have, all of their demands and commands, all of their political rituals, laws, books, courts, and so on, amount to nothing more than the symptom of a profound delusional psychosis. Nothing they do can have any legitimacy, any more than if you do the same thing on your own, unless they somehow acquired rights that you do not have, and that is impossible, since no one on earth and no group of people on earth could possibly have given them such superhuman rights. No political ritual can alter morality. No election can make an evil act into a good act. Now, why am I having trouble seeing them? Okay. If it is bad for you to do something, then it is bad for those in government to do it. And if the same morality that applies to you also applies to those in government, if those in public office have the same rights that you do, and no more than government ceases to be government, then government ceases to be government. If judged by the same standards as other mortals are judged, those wearing the label of government are nothing but a gang of thugs, terrorists, thieves, and murderers, and their actions lack any legitimacy, any validity, any authority. They are nothing but a band of crooks who insist that various documents and rituals have given them the right to be crooks. Sadly, even most of their victims believe them. Altering morality. The concept of authority depends upon the concepts of right and wrong, i.e. morality. To wit, having authority does not merely mean having the ability to forcibly control other people, something possessed by countless thugs, thieves, and gangs who are not referred to as authority. It means having the right to control other people, which implies that those beings controlled have a moral obligation to obey, not just to avoid punishment, but also because obedience, being law-abiding, is morally good, and disobedience, breaking the law, is morally bad. Thus, for there to be such a thing as authority, there must be such a thing as right and wrong. How one defines right and wrong, or what one believes to be the source of morality, does not particularly matter for purposes of this discussion. Use your own definitions, and the logic will still apply. While the concept of authority requires the existence of a right and wrong, it is also ruled out entirely by the existence of right and wrong. A simple analogy will prove that seemingly odd claim. The laws of mathematics are an objective, unchanging part of reality. If you add 2 apples to 2 apples, you will have 4 apples. Those who study mathematics seek to understand more about reality, to learn about what already is. One who entered the field of math with the stated goal of altering the laws of mathematics would be seen as insane. And rightfully so. Imagine how absurd it would be for some math professor to proclaim, "I hereby decree that henceforth 2 plus 2 shall equal 5. Yet such lunacy is what occurs every time politicians enact legislation. They are not merely observing the world and trying to best determine what is right and wrong, something every individual should and must do for himself. No, they are claiming to be altering morality by issuing some new decree. In other words, like the insane math professor who thinks he can by mere declaration make 2 plus 2 equal 5, the politicians speak and act as if they are the source of morality, as if they have the power to make up via legislation what is right and wrong, as if an act can become bad simply because they declared it to be illegal. Whether the issue is math, morality, or anything else, there is a huge difference between trying to determine what is true and trying to dictate what is true. The former is useful and the latter is insane, and the latter is what those in government pretend to do every day. In their legislation, the politicians do not merely express how they think people should behave, based upon universal standards of morality. Anyone who has the right to say, "I think doing this is bad and doing that is good," but no one would call such opinions laws. I'm going to read that again. Anyone has the right to say, "I think doing this thing is bad and I think doing this thing is good," but no one would call such opinions laws. Instead, the message from the politician is, "We are making that thing bad and making this thing good." In short, every legislator suffers from a profoundly delusional God complex, which leads him to believe that, via political rituals, he actually has the power, along with his fellow legislators, to change right and wrong by mere decree. Mortals cannot alter morality any more than they can alter the laws of mathematics. Their understanding of something may change, but they cannot, by decree, change the nature of the universe. Nor would anyone sane attempt to. Yet that is what every new law passed by politicians pretends to be, a change in what constitutes moral behavior. And as idiotic as that notion is, it is a necessary element to the belief in government. The idea that the masses are morally obligated to obey the lawmakers, that disobeying, breaking the law, is morally wrong. Not because the politician commands happen to match the objective rules of morality, but because their commands dictate and determine what is moral and what is not. Understanding the simple fact that mere mortals cannot make good into evil or evil into good, all by itself makes the myth of government disintegrate. Anyone who fully understands that one simple truth cannot continue to believe in government, because if the politicians lack such a supernatural power, their commands carry no inherent legitimacy, and they cease to be authority. Unless good is whatever the politicians say it is, unless right and wrong actually come from the whims of the politician gods, then no one can have any moral obligation to respect or obey the commands of the politicians, and their laws become utterly invalid and irrelevant. In short, if there is such a thing as right and wrong at all, however you wish to define those terms, then the laws of government are always illegitimate and worthless. And I will end there for today.